Have you seen it this bad before?
This is the worst I've seen it in 25 years I've been up here. Yeah, from the coast, yeah.
Nelson, Tasman remain under a local state of emergency after back-to-back severe weather events hammered the region.
Fire and Emergency New Zealand are going door to door in vulnerable parts of Tapawera, asking people to evacuate.
Civil Defence teams will be visiting properties in flood-affected areas today after the third weekend in a row of heavy rain. Minister for Emergency Management Mark Mitchell has said the damage will be in the millions without a doubt.
Is there anyone out there who's still a climate change sceptic?
It's been a bit of a constant, over the last 4 or 5 years. The weather has just been ugly, The repercussions of that have been shown on the roading network, it's been shown on the beaches, some of the seawalls around. It's just become a bit of a constant feature in our life, right?
As those supposed 1 in 100-year floods keep rolling in, claiming lives, destroying properties, it's obvious that climate change is here.
I think there has been a lot of emphasis both in reporting and people's understanding of climate change on climate change itself and the science behind that and what's happening and how it's getting worse. And we're now starting to shift our focus because of these severe weather events that we see more frequently and at a greater level of severity to what that actually means for us now and the fact that climate change is no longer this far-off, distant future prospect, but something that is affecting real people and real lives at this very moment.
Yeah, and it's not just like stop using that deodorant because you're making a hole in the sky. It's my feet are getting wet. Yeah. And I'm in my house.
Exactly. And even if my feet are not getting wet, my neighbour's house is flooding or my kid's school is flooding or other infrastructure that I use every day without even thinking about it until something happens to it is being affected.
So how do we adapt? And who pays? I'm Alexia Russell, and on The Detail today, I'm talking to RNZ In Depth reporter Kate Newton about a new report that spells out to the government that it can't keep bailing out residents whose homes have been washed away.
Advice given to the government on how to deal with the cost of climate change has been described as, quote, morally bankrupt by one expert. Recommendations include phasing out property buyouts for homes destroyed by storms or flooding. But critics say the recommendations, if they are adopted, would leave homeowners and individuals on their own.
People who are affected by climate change, sea level rise and so on, will be essentially left to cope with the problems themselves.
The findings of the Independent Reference Group, which was set up by the Ministry for the Environment, are politically tricky and extremely expensive. But so is every option for dealing with this. That's why the Prime Minister wants bipartisan agreement on the issue.
I think in principle, yes, the government won't be able to keep bailing people out in this way. That's why Simon Watts has worked quite hard to get a bipartisan approach with all the parties in Parliament to say, look, there's going to be governments of different colours and hues going forward over the next couple of generations. This is a long-term issue. We need a proper framework in place to work out whether it's landowners, whether it's councils, whether it's central government, banks, insurers, that actually have to create a framework for dealing with these sort of weather events.
Councils too say there has to be a line in the sand over payouts.
Probably will need to be a point in time where we say that the government won't be stepping in or local councils won't be stepping in.
But there are already precedents for paying people out. After the Auckland anniversary floods 3 years ago, the council estimated it would probably need to buy up to 1,264 homes for about $1.28 billion. There's only $2 billion in its storm recovery fund, and that doesn't leave a lot for resilience work, especially since it's already committed $53 million to a project underway in Mangere. Paying for climate change adaptation and managed retreat is a massive financial dagger sitting over the country. I asked Kate Newton what mitigation planning involves.
So there's a whole lot that goes into it, and every step of it is complex and every step of it is expensive. But we also need to remember that even if we do nothing, it's still expensive. I think the top estimates of costs involved with Cyclone Gabrielle was $14.5 billion. It's a huge amount of money. But you're looking at things like even just understanding where the risk is and how severe that risk is and how it might change in the future is a huge amount of work. So there's modelling that's been done at a sort of macro level, looking at New Zealand as a whole, and then you get down into the nitty-gritty of, okay, which regions are most affected? which communities within those regions are most affected. And NIWA, or as it is now called, since it's just merged in the last couple of weeks with GNS, Earth Sciences New Zealand, they've done a huge amount of modelling around climate change risk and also adaptation or the risks that we need to understand to be able to adapt. So they've looked at coastal inundation, so that's your sea level rise and sea level flooding, and with that also where the land is shifting. Some bits of land in New Zealand are lifting up, others are sinking. So you look at somewhere like South Dunedin, which has a double whammy of both facing sea level rise, but also it is literally sinking.
We have analysed all the available information on current and future natural hazards and risks, and we've used that with community feedback to create 7 potential futures for what South Dunedin could look like in 2100, depending on the choices made over time.
So they've got a whole raft of options. I think they've got about 16 different kind of sets of options that would have different pros and cons that they've put out for consultation recently. But it's a huge piece of work. But I think that is widely acknowledged as dealing with it in a constructive way, in a way that is trying to bring the community along and involve them rather than imposing top-down from council or central government or whoever else about what the solution is.
Each approach involves choices and trade-offs. For each future, we have considered the key approaches for managing water, costs and benefits, the degree of difficulty of implementation, how many properties are affected, and the risk that remains to residents after implementing these solutions. There's a lot to think about.
Earth Sciences is about to release another report on inland inundation.
So that's the type of flooding that we saw in particularly somewhere like Auckland, where that flooding was really pepper-potted. If you remember in 2023, there were people at the bottom of a dip in a street who had 1.5 metres of water in their houses, and there were people at the top of the street who were fine. Then once you've actually identified the risk, how do you plan for it? What do you do? There is a myriad of options. Seawalls, blue-green infrastructure like wetlands. You've got flood banks or stop banks. You can move people out of the way. You can move people's houses to different locations. You can move the people out themselves. And all of that, it kind of has to be factored in, and all of it costs a huge amount of money.
It's not just the money, though, is it? It's the emotional factor, the emotion that goes with it. And then you look at what's happening in, say, for Milford on the north shore of Auckland. They're by the sea. You would have thought that's where the imminent danger came. During the Auckland floods, the Wairau Creek flooded and they got really badly, one of the worst places in Auckland to get hit. And now the plan, which is to reuse the golf course as a wetland, is run up against very, very staunch opposition. So in a way, that's a little microcosm, isn't it, of what's happening here, the terrible devastation and then the opposition to the solutions.
Exactly, and all of the competing priorities that go into it, and it's mind-boggling, and one person's risk right now might not meet another person's risk threshold, and it's where do you meet and actually find a solution that everyone can agree on, and then agree on how we're going to pay for it as well. And you talked about emotion, and this is one of the most difficult things, is that the decisions that we're making at the moment, and I think will continue to be made in the future, are not necessarily based on what is the rational, almost logical response, because people's homes, it's one of the most emotional decisions or positions of, all of the feelings around that.
People suffer from all kinds of cognitive biases, myopia, confirmation bias, optimism bias, status quo bias. There's lots and lots of them, and that these have a profound influence on whether people make sensible decisions or not. And quite apart from cognitive biases, lots of people lack choices. They lack the resources to make good decisions.
Some people will move, some won't. Councils having to provide services to a community that's sort of maybe gradually emptying out. People there who can't afford to move will be trapped into a risky situation. They may be facing regular floods of their properties. So I just don't think it's in the best interest of the country to essentially leave it to the market and people's individual decisions.
Now, it's local body election year, and there's some things that I want to talk to you about. This latest report that you've done lots of stories on that involve councils, because it's an absolute can of worms, isn't it? Because, for example, the government is proposing a rates cap to stop councils raising their rates. This report that came out specifically says that's a no-go if council's going to have to keep doing these flood protection measures, and that they ought to be doing the flood protection measures because it's a lot cheaper to do the protection measure than it is to mop up after the flood. So how do we work that one out?
Yeah, so the report that came out last week does put a lot of the onus back on local government. It says actually central government shouldn't get involved in paying for a lot of this unless there's specific risk to central government infrastructure. It's not totally clear from the report what that means. They might be talking about schools or other infrastructure, things like airports, hospitals. But so it puts the onus for both finding a way to pay for it, whether that's through, I don't know, a targeted rate, lifting rates for everybody, which is why I guess it's advocating against a rates cap, and also the planning side of it, which is a huge thing, and especially for little councils who may only have one planner, who may not specialise in adaptation planning because it is a highly complex specialist type of planning. How do they do all of that as well and actually work out how to adapt and what the best thing is to do?
The Vice President of Local Government NZ, Campbell Barry, told RNZ's Midday Report that the sense of urgency in this new report was good to see, but
the concern we have is that there's still a real lack of clarity around who pays. We are concerned around the costs that will fall onto local government without having the funding and financing tools to be able to cater for that. We're the first to say that councils do need to be at the table in these conversations and how we actually implement climate adaptation, but we will be set up to fail if we have the same funding and financing framework that we currently operate with. We need the government to be clear around who pays and how. And I think that the report, while it has some good intent, is very silent on that number one thing that we need to have a bit of clarity on.
Without clarity for councils on planning, flood mitigation, managed retreat and payouts and their legal liabilities, we're creating problems for the future. For example, balancing the need for high-density housing with weather hazards.
Since the series of devastating floods in January of 2023, Auckland Council has approved the building of 4,000 new homes, wait for it, on floodplains. Many of these will be built in areas where locals had to flee for their lives during the previous flooding events.
The problem here is one of what the hell is council there for if it's not to demonstrate the fact that this area or that area should or should not be developed.
Well, sometimes if they do say no, those developers will take the council to court and have in the past won their cases.
Yeah, although some people I've talked to have struggled to actually point me to examples of this happening, but I do think that there is a real fear, which has had a chilling effect on how councils make decisions, that developers will do this because the RMA does favour development going ahead. Yes, there's a lot of red tape. A lot of people don't like the RMA for very good reasons. But actually, when it comes down to it, if a developer can show that they've taken reasonable steps to mitigate the risk to that particular property, then it very well will go ahead.
Is it a council's job in legislation? Is it legislated that councils must do flood protection?
Not flood protection per se. There's no mandate within legislation for councils to have adaptation planning, which I think is part of the reason why we're now seeing legislation drafted and developed, some kind of Climate Adaptation Act, which is coming down the pipeline. Simon Watts, the Climate Change Minister, is responsible for that. He's promised something before the end of the year, although he also promised something at the start of this year. So
yeah, and Luxon was talking about that this week on Morning Report, saying that, it's in train, but they want to get bipartisan support. It doesn't sound like it's something that's happening very soon.
No, and it's something that's been a long time coming. I think Simon Watts is running into similar problems to his predecessor, James Shaw, who tried for 6 years to pass a Climate Adaptation Act and was not able to get that through before the government that he was part of left office. And
so what was the main resistance?
The main resistance was not so much resistance, but around the complexity of actually how we do it, who pays for it, all of the things that you and I are sitting here discussing now. And again, that need to get bipartisan agreement on what to do and how to do it, because this is one of those big thorny issues that if you're changing the rules and changing how people adapt every 3 or 6 or 9 years, it gives nobody any certainty in the future. But as part of the work that James Shaw was doing, there was a huge report, about 300 pages, looking at climate adaptation. There was an expert working group that got together and sort of scratched their heads, economists, disaster planning and recovery experts, climate change experts, and they said what we should be looking at is having essentially spatial plans for all these different areas, identifying the areas of particular risk, deciding whether building a seawall or stop banks or a wetland will be enough, and if it's not at a certain threshold, saying actually we are going to mandate that people have to move. At the moment there isn't really any legislation that can mandate people moving. There is the Public Works Act, which could be used to acquire land in some of these cases, but it's a bit of a roundabout way of doing it.
Yeah, the Public Works Act was designed for things like there's a motorway going through your property, right?
Exactly. There have been examples of this happening. One recent example actually is in the Hutt Valley. There have been houses that have been compulsorily acquired via the Public Works Act. A lot of them were negotiated with homeowners who willingly agreed to do it so that they could set back the stop banks further and actually create a little bit more room for a stretch of the Hutt River. And it's also happened in West Auckland 20 years ago. They acquired a couple of hundred houses.
Wow. Because when you think about it, why should it be the council's job, and for that, read the ratepayers pick up the bill, to pay people out for their homes because of something that's happening that's quite, naturally occurring? I mean, sure, maybe their job to try and mitigate things before it happens, but then when it happens, you do have to ask the question, why should it be effectively the ratepayers who pay that compensation? And yet that's been the expectation.
Yeah, and I think in the expert working group in this most recent report and all sorts of reporting that's happened around this issue have talked about the moral hazard is the phrase they use to describe the situation we've created, where as soon as a big disaster happens, there's an expectation that people get paid out. And they don't just get paid out a nominal amount, they get quite generous payouts at market value or even over once you take into account legal costs and demolition costs. So why the council? I guess because, it was council and the government 50-50 picked up the tab in Hawke's Bay after Cyclone Gabrielle. But I think it comes down to what's the alternative, and is that to send natural hazards and, emergency planning ministers and so on to these disaster-struck regions and say, sorry, you're on your own. And at what point does that actually kick in? To what point do we say, actually, the individual risk and responsibility is now over to you?
Do you think there's still a lack of realism from people about, the people who have a batch on the waterfront, the people who've lived somewhere for 30 years and they can't imagine themselves sliding down the hill?
I think so, and I think particularly for people who've lived somewhere for 30 years or longer where there wasn't a risk written down on paper or a modelling somewhere, who find it very hard to accept that has changed. And that's a totally normal human response and reaction, I think, that denial of something that is going to require some pain on your part, no matter what decision you make, if you stay and wear the risk or if you leave and wear the emotional and financial cost of making that decision.
Do you think ratepayers are fully aware of the risk here?
No, I don't think so. We know that local government generally has a financial sustainability problem with the challenges that it faces in general upkeep of infrastructure, water, transport and the likes. We also know that with increasing weather events and having to put in climate adaptation options and how we protect our communities in the future comes at a huge price tag. And if we don't fundamentally change how local government is funded and how we pay for these things, then it will fall on our ratepayers as well. So, it's kind of ironic, right? In the last few days, we've been talking about things like rates capping. If you brought in a rates cap, then initiatives like this potentially couldn't be done by councils. So we really do need to make sure we're addressing the sort of foundational issues here.
One of the key points in this new report was the vital importance of information and sharing it so that individuals, communities, councils and industries can make informed decisions on things like where not to build houses. But as Kate said, some councils are just too small to have people to do that flood risk work. Others who are doing the work are facing redundancy because of job cuts.
Once they're gone as well. I've heard with cuts that have occurred within organisations like NIWA and like GNS that you'll have a small team working on something specialist, and 3 or 4 people of those people lost their jobs last year, immediately went to Europe and other places overseas where their expertise is highly sought, have got really great jobs, and the chances of luring them back if we decide that actually that's information we do need is really low. The people who do have really detailed data are insurance companies, because their entire business is predicated on being able to accurately predict risk. So regardless of what council is doing and the decisions they're making, insurance companies are making their own decisions and pricing their premiums and offering insurance accordingly.
Could they not share that information with councils?
Well, there's a big debate going on about this. I've asked for insurance data, and unsurprisingly, they've said no. I've been able to get some modelling that Treasury's done, which it was doing on a 3-monthly basis. Nicola Willis, the Finance Minister, recently asked them to cut that down to an annual report. But insurance companies, I guess, entirely understandably want to protect their ability to predict that risk, because that's the entire sort of commercial premise of how they make money. There is sort of work going on to increase some of this information sharing. Within this report itself, it talks about actually, essentially to hell with the commercial basis for withholding some of this information. We actually need to give people accurate, timely, updated information so that they know what is going on with their own house or the place that they're renting or living in.
Do you think, say 6 years ago, people didn't really understand why this was so expensive? And, you used to hear the odd lone voice say, this is going to be the most expensive thing that's ever hit the country. This is a big, huge financial risk. Is it only since the Auckland floods and Gabrielle that we understand this?
Yeah, I think it was the scale and also the timing, the fact that those 2 events happened one after the other, the number of people involved, the number of houses, the massive, massive destruction of infrastructure. I mean, railway tracks in Hawke's Bay. We've got roads that are still not drivable in West Auckland. I think that people could see with their own eyes what this means for us in the future.
It's pretty scary, isn't it? I mean, in the scale of things the government has to spend money on, where does this come?
Well, it's right up there. So Treasury has a sort of list of things that could threaten the economic stability of New Zealand. And I think right up there are health and superannuation, which I think, would make sense to most people. Coming in third, they have actually pegged the cost of climate change and climate adaptation as something that New Zealand could really struggle with, particularly if we don't plan for it and we're hit with wave after wave of cleaning up post-disaster, which, you can't spread the cost, you can't plan for the cost. And the more you spend on clean-up, the less you have to spend on proactive adaptation. That's the risk.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Alex Harmer and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Kate Newton. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.